Chapter 25, Part 6 of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 25, Reigns of Jovian and Valentinian, Division of the Empire. Part 6. 4. The ignominious treaty which saved the army of Jovian had been faithfully executed on the side of the Romans, and as they had solemnly renounced the sovereignty and alliance of Armenia and Iberia, those tributary kingdoms were exposed, without protection, to the arms of the Persian monarch. Sapor entered the Armenian territories at the head of a formidable host of cuirassiers, of archers, and of mercenary foot. But it was the invariable practice of Sapor to mix war with negotiation, and to consider falsehood and perjury as the most powerful instruments of regal policy. He affected to praise the prudent and moderate conduct of the king of Armenia, and the unsuspicious Tyrannus was persuaded, by the repeated assurances of insidious friendship, to deliver his person to the hands of a faithless and cruel enemy. In the midst of a splendid entertainment he was bound in chains of silver, as an honor due to the blood of Arsacides, and, after a short confinement in the Tower of Oblivion at Ecbatana, he was released from the miseries of life, either by his own dagger or by that of an assassin. The kingdom of Armenia was reduced to the state of a Persian province. The administration was shared between a distinguished satrap and a favorite eunuch, and Sapor marched without delay to subdue the martial spirit of the Iberians. Sauromaces, who reigned in that country by the permission of the emperors, was expelled by a superior force, and, as an insult to the majesty of Rome, the King of Kings placed a diadem on the head of his abject vassal Aspacuras. The city of Autogorasa was the only place of Armenia which presumed to resist the efforts of his arms. The treasure deposited in that strong fortress tempted the avarice of Sapor, but the danger of Olympias, the wife or widow of the Armenian king, excited the public compassion and animated the desperate valor of her subjects and soldiers. The Persians were surprised and repulsed under the walls of Autogorasa by a bold and well-concerted sally of the besieged. But the forces of Sapor were continually renewed and increased. The hopeless courage of the garrison was exhausted. The strength of the walls yielded to the assault, and the proud conqueror, after wasting the rebellious city with fire and sword, led away captive an unfortunate queen, who, in a more auspicious hour, had been the destined bride of the son of Constantine. Yet if Sapor already triumphed in the easy conquest of two dependent kingdoms, he soon felt that a country is unsubdued as long as the minds of the people are actuated by a hostile, contumacious spirit. The satraps, whom he was obliged to trust, embraced the first opportunity of regaining the affection of their countrymen, and of signalizing their immortal hatred to the Persian name. Since the conversion of the Armenians and Iberians, those nations considered the Christians as the favorites, and the magicians as the adversaries of the Supreme Being. The influence of the clergy over a superstitious people was uniformly exerted in the cause of Rome, and as long as the successors of Constantine disputed with those of Artaxerxes the sovereignty of the intermediate provinces, the religious connection always drew a decisive advantage into the scale of the empire. A numerous and active party acknowledged Para, the son of Tyrannus, as the lawful sovereign of Armenia, and his title to the throne was deeply rooted in the hereditary succession of 500 years. By the unanimous consent of the Iberians, the country was equally divided between the rival princes, and Aspacuras, who owed his diadem to the choice of Sapor, was obliged to declare that his regard for his children, who were detained as hostages by the tyrant, was the only consideration which prevented him from openly renouncing the alliance of Persia. The Emperor Valens, who respected the obligations of the treaty, and who was apprehensive of involving the East in a dangerous war, ventured, with slow and cautious measures, to support the Roman party in the kingdoms of Iberia and Armenia. 12 legions established the authority of Sauromaces on the banks of the Cyrus. The Euphrates was protected by the valor of Arintheus. A powerful army under the command of Count Trajan and of Vladimir, king of the Alemanni, fixed their camp on the confines of Armenia. But they were strictly enjoined not to commit the first hostilities, which might be understood as a breach of the treaty; and such was the implicit obedience of the Roman general, that they retreated with exemplary patience under a shower of Persian arrows until they had clearly acquired a just title to an honorable and legitimate victory. Yet these appearances of war insensibly subsided in a vain and tedious negotiation. The contending parties supported their claims by mutual reproaches of perfidy and ambition; and it should seem that the original treaty was expressed in very obscure terms, since they were reduced to the necessity of making their inconclusive appeal to the partial testimony of the generals of the two nations who had assisted in the negotiations. The invasion of the Goths and Huns, which soon afterward shook the foundations of the Roman Empire, exposed the provinces of Asia to the arms of Sapor. But the declining age, and perhaps the infirmities, of the monarch suggested new maxims of tranquillity and moderation. His death, which happened in the full maturity of a reign of 70 years, changed in a moment the court and councils of Persia, and their attention was most probably engaged by domestic troubles, and the distant efforts of a Carmanian war. The remembrance of ancient injuries was lost in the enjoyment of peace. The kingdoms of Armenia and Iberia were permitted, by the mutual, though tacit, consent of both empires, to resume their doubtful neutrality. In the first years of the reign of Theodosius, a Persian embassy arrived at Constantinople to excuse the unjustifiable measures of the former reign, and to offer, as the tribute of friendship, or even of respect, a splendid present of gems, of silk, and of Indian elephants. In the general picture of affairs of the East under the reign of Valens, the adventures of Para form one of the most striking and singular objects. The noble youth, by the persuasion of his mother Olympias, had escaped through the Persian host that besieged Artogerassa, and implored the protection of the emperor of the East. By his timid counsels, Para was alternately supported and recalled, and restored and betrayed. The hopes of the Armenians were sometimes raised by the presence of their natural sovereign, and the ministers of Valens were satisfied that they preserved the integrity of the public faith, if their vassal was not suffered to assume the diadem and title of king. But they soon repented of their own rashness. They were confounded by the reproaches and threats of the Persian monarch. They found reason to distrust the cruel and inconsistent temper of Para himself, who sacrificed to the slightest suspicions the lives of his most faithful servants, and held a secret and disgraceful correspondence with the assassin of his father and the enemy of his country. Under the specious pretense of consulting with the emperor on the subject of their common interest, Para was persuaded to descend from the mountains of Armenia, where his party was in arms, and to trust his independence and safety to the discretion of a pestiferous court. The king of Armenia, for such he appeared in his own eyes and in those of his nation, was received with due honors by the governors of the provinces through which he passed. But when he arrived at Taurus in Cilicia, the progress was stopped under various pretenses. His motions were watched with respectful vigilance, and he gradually discovered that he was a prisoner in the hands of the Romans. Para suppressed his indignation, dissembled his fears, and after secretly preparing his escape, mounted on horseback with 300 of his faithful followers. The officer stationed at the door of his apartment immediately communicated his flight to the councillor of Cilicia, who overtook him in the suburbs, and endeavored, without success, to dissuade him from prosecuting his rash and dangerous design. The legion was ordered to pursue the royal fugitive, but the pursuit of infantry could not be very alarming to a body of light cavalry, and upon the first cloud of arrows that was discharged into the air, they retreated with precipitation to the gates of Taurus. After an incessant march of 2 days and 2 nights, Para and his Armenians reached the banks of the Euphrates, but the passage of the river, which they were obliged to swim, was attended with some delay and some loss. The country was alarmed, and the 2 roads, which were only separated by an interval of 3 miles, had been occupied by 3,000 archers on horseback, under the command of a count and a tribune. Para must have yielded to superior force, if the accidental arrival of a friendly traveller had not revealed the danger and the means of escape. A dark and almost impervious path securely conveyed the Armenian troop through the thicket, and Para had left behind him the count and the tribune, while they patiently expected his approach along the public highways. They returned to the imperial court to excuse their want of diligence or success, and seriously alleged that the king of Armenia, who was a skilful magician, had transformed himself and his followers, and passed before their eyes under a borrowed shape. After his return to his native kingdom, Para still continued to profess himself the friend and ally of the Romans, but the Romans had injured him too deeply ever to forgive, and the secret sentence of his death was signed in the Council of Valens. The execution of the bloody deed was committed to the subtle prudence of Count Trajan, and he had the merit of insinuating himself into the confidence of the credulous prince. That he might find an opportunity of stabbing him to the heart, Para was invited to a Roman banquet, which had been prepared with the pomp and sensibility of the East. The hall resounded with cheerful music. The company was already heated with wine, when the count retired for an instant, drew his sword, and gave the signal of the murder. A robust and desperate barbarian instantly rushed on the king of Armenia, and though he bravely defended his life with the first weapon that chance offered to his hand, the table of the imperial general was stained with the royal blood of a guest and an ally. Such were the weak and wicked maxims of the Roman administration, that to attain a doubtful object of political interest, the laws of nations and the sacred rights of hospitality were inhumanly violated in the face of the world. 5. During a peaceful interval of 30 years, the Romans secured their frontiers, and the Goths extended their dominions. The victories of the great Hermanric, king of the Ostrogoths, and the most noble of the races of the Amale, have been compared by the enthusiasm of his countrymen to the exploits of Alexander, with this singular and almost incredible difference, that the martial spirits of the Gothic hero, instead of being supported by the vigor of youth, was displayed with glory and success in the extreme period of human life, between the age of 80 and 110 years. The independent tribes were persuaded or compelled to acknowledge the king of the Ostrogoths as the sovereign of the Gothic nation. The chiefs of the Visigoths, or Thervingi, renounced the royal title, and assumed the more humble appellation of judges, and among those judges Athanaric, Fritigern, and Alavisus were the most illustrious, by their personal merit as well as by their vicinity to the Roman provinces. These domestic conquests, which increased the military power of Hermanric, enlarged his ambitious designs. He invaded the adjacent countries of the north, and 12 considerable nations, whose names and limits cannot be accurately defined, successively yielded to the superiority of the Gothic arms. The Heruli, who inhabited the marshy lands near the lake Maeotis, were renowned for their strength and agility, and the assistance of their light infantry was eagerly solicited and highly esteemed in the wars of the barbarians. But the active spirit of the Heruli was subdued by the slow and steady perseverance of the Goths, and after a bloody action, in which the king was slain, the remains of that warlike tribe became a useful accession to the camp of Hermanric. He then marched against the Veneti, unskilled in the use of arms, and formidable only by their numbers, which filled the wide extent of the plains of modern Poland. The victorious Goths, who were not inferior in numbers, prevailed in the contest, by the decisive advantages of exercise and discipline. After the submission of the Veneti, the conqueror advanced, without resistance, as far as the confines of Estii, an ancient people whose name is still preserved in the province of Estonia. Those distant inhabitants of the Baltic coast were supported by the labors of agriculture, enriched by the trade of amber, and consecrated by the peculiar worship of the mother of the gods. But the scarcity of iron obliged the Estinian warriors to content themselves with wooden clubs, and the reduction of that wealthy country is ascribed to the prudence, rather than to the arms, of Hermanric. His dominions, which extended from the Danube to the Baltic, included the native seats and the recent acquisitions of the Goths, and he reigned over the greatest part of Germany and Scythia with the authority of a conqueror, and sometimes with the cruelty of a tyrant. But he reigned over a part of the globe incapable of perpetuating and adoring the glory of its heroes. The name Hermanric is almost buried in oblivion, his exploits are imperfectly known, and the Romans themselves appeared unconscious of the progress of an aspiring power which threatened the liberty of the North and the peace of the empire. The Goths had contracted an hereditary attachment for the imperial house of Constantine, of whose power and liberality they had received so many signal proofs. They respected the public peace, and if a hostile band sometimes presumed to pass the Roman limit, their irregular conduct was candidly ascribed to the ungovernable spirit of the barbarian youth. The contempt for two new and obscure princes, who had been raised to the throne by a popular election, inspired the Goths with bolder hopes, and, while they agitated some design of marching their confederate forces under the national standard, they were easily tempted to embrace the party of Procopius, and to foment, by their dangerous aid, the civil discord of the Romans. The public treaty might stipulate no more than 10,000 auxiliaries, but the design was so zealously adopted by the chiefs of the Visigoth, that the army which passed the Danube amounted to a number of 30,000 men. They marched with the proud confidence that their invincible valor would decide the fate of the Roman empire, and the provinces of Thrace groaned under the weight of the barbarians, who displayed the insolence of masters and the licentiousness of enemies. But the intemperance which gratified their appetites retarded their progress, and before the Goths could receive any certain intelligence of the defeat and death of Procopius, they perceived, by the hostile state of the country, that the civil and military powers were resumed by his successful rival. A chain of posts and fortifications, skilfully deposed by Valens, or the generals of Valens, resisted their march, prevented their retreat, and intercepted their subsistence. The fierceness of the barbarians was tamed and suspended by hunger. They diligently threw down their arms at the feet of the conqueror, who offered them food and chains. The numerous captives were distributed in all the cities of the East, and the provincials, who were soon familiarized with their savage appearance, ventured, by degrees, to measure their own strength with these formidable adversaries, whose name had so long been the object of their terror. The king of Scythia and Hermanric alone could deserve so lofty a title, was grieved and exasperated by this national calamity. His ambassadors loudly complained at the court of Valens of the infraction of the ancient and solemn alliance which had so long subsisted between the Romans and the Goths. They alleged that they had fulfilled the duty of allies by assisting the kinsman and successor of the Emperor Julian. They required the immediate restitution of the noble captives, and they urged a very singular claim, that the Gothic generals, marching in arms and in hostile array, were entitled to the sacred character and privileges of ambassadors. The decent but peremptory refusal of these extravagant demands was signified to the barbarians by Victor, master general of the cavalry, who expressed with force and dignity the just complaints of the emperor of the East. The negotiation was interrupted, and the manly exhortations of Valentinian encouraged his timid brother to vindicate the insulted majesty of the empire. The splendor and magnitude of this Gothic war was celebrated by a contemporary historian, but the event scarcely deserved the attention of posterity, except as the preliminary steps of the approaching decline and fall of the empire. Instead of leading the nations of Germany and Scythia to the banks of the Danube, or even to the gates of Constantinople, the aged monarch of the Goths resigned to the brave Athanaric the danger and glory of a defensive war against an enemy who wielded with a feeble hand the powers of a mighty state. A bridge of boats was established upon the Danube, the presence of Valens animated his troops, and his ignorance of the art of war was compensated by personal bravery and a wise deference to the advice of Victor and Arintheus, his master general of the cavalry and infantry. The operations of the campaign were conducted by their skill and experience, but they found it impossible to drive the Visigoths from their strong posts in the mountains, and the devastation of the plains obliged the Romans themselves to repass the Danube on the approach of winter. The incessant rains, which swelled the waters of the river, produced a tacit suspension of arms, and confined the Emperor Valens, during the whole course of the ensuing summer, to his camp of Marcianopolis. The third year of the war was more favorable to the Romans and more pernicious to the Goths. The interruption of trade deprived the barbarians of the objects of luxury which they already confounded with the necessities of life, and the dissolution of a very extensive tract of country threatened them with the horrors of famine. Athanaric was provoked, or compelled, to risk a battle which he lost in the plains, and the pursuit was rendered more bloody by the cruel precaution of the victorious generals, who had promised a large reward for the head of every Goth that was brought into the imperial camp. The submission of the barbarians appeased the resentment of Valens and his council. The emperor listened with satisfaction to the flattering and eloquent remonstrance of the Senate of Constantinople, which assumed for the first time a share in the public deliberations, and the same generals, Victor and Arintheus, who had successfully directed the conduct of the war, were empowered to regulate the conditions of the peace. The freedom of trade, which the Goths had hitherto enjoyed, was restricted to 2 cities on the Danube. The rashness of their leaders was severely punished by the suspension of their pensions and subsidies, and the exception, which was stipulated in the favor of Athanaric alone, was more advantageous than honorable to the judge of the Visigoths. Athanaric, who on this occasion appears to have consulted his private interest without expecting the orders of his sovereign, supported his own dignity and that of his tribe in the personal interview which was proposed by the ministers of Valens. He persisted in his declaration that it was impossible for him, without incurring the guilt of perjury, ever to set his foot on the territory of the empire, and it is more than probable that his regard for the sanctity of an oath was confirmed by the recent and fatal examples of Roman treachery. The Danube, which separated the dominions of the 2 independent nations, was chosen for the scene of the conference. The emperor of the East and the judge of the Visigoths, accompanied by an equal number of armed followers, advanced in their respective barges to the middle of the stream. After the ratification of the treaty and delivery of hostages, Valens returned in triumph to Constantinople, and the Goths remained in a state of tranquillity about 6 years, till they were violently impelled against the Roman Empire by an innumerable host of Scythians, who appeared to issue from the frozen regions of the north. The emperor of the West, who had resigned to his brother the command of the lower Danube, reserved for his immediate care the defence of the Rhaetian and Illyrian provinces, which spread so many hundred miles along the greatest of the European rivers. The active policy of Valentinian was continually employed in adding new fortifications to the security of the frontier, but the abuse of this policy provoked the just resentment of the barbarians. The Quadi complained that the ground for an intended fortress had been marked out on their territories, and their complaints were urged with so much reason and moderation that Equitius, master general of Illyricum, consented to suspend the prosecution of the work till he should be more clearly informed of the will of his sovereign. This fair occasion of injuring a rival and of advancing the fortune of his son was eagerly embraced by the inhuman Maximian, the prefect, or rather tyrant, of Gaul. The passions of Valentinian were impatient of control, and he credulously listened to the assurances of his favorite, that if the government of Valeria and the direction of the work were entrusted to the zeal of his son Marcellinus, the emperor would no longer be importuned with the audacious remonstrances of the barbarians. The subjects of Rome and the natives of Germany were insulted by the arrogance of a young and worthless minister, who considered his rapid elevation as proof and reward of his superior merit. He affected, however, to receive the modest application of Gabinius, king of the Quadi, with some attention and regard. But this artful civility concealed a dark and brooding design, and the credulous prince was persuaded to accept the pressing invitation of Marcellinus. I am at a loss how to vary the narrative of similar crimes, or how to relate that, in the course of the same year, but in remote parts of the empire, the inhospitable table of two imperial generals was stained with the royal blood of two guests and allies, inhumanly murdered by their order and in their presence. The fate of Gabinius and of Para was the same, but the cruel death of their sovereign was resented in a very different manner by the servile temper of the Armenians and the free and daring spirit of the Germans. The Quadi were much declined from that formidable power which, in the time of Marcus Antonius, had spread terror to the gates of Rome. But they still possessed arms and courage. Their courage was animated by despair, and they obtained the usual reinforcement of the cavalry of their Sarmatian allies. So improvident was the assassin Marcellinus, that he chose the moment when the bravest veterans had been drawn away to suppress the revolt of Firmus, and the whole province was exposed, with a very feeble defense, to the rage of the exasperated barbarians. They invaded Pannonia in the season of harvest, unmercifully destroying every object of plunder which they could not easily transport, and either disregarded or demolished the empty fortifications. The Princess Constantia, the daughter of the Emperor Constantius, and the granddaughter of the great Constantine, very narrowly escaped. That royal maid, who had innocently supported the revolt of Procopius, was now the destined wife of the heir of the Western Empire. She traversed the peaceful province with a splendid and unarmed train. Her person was saved from danger, and the republic from disgrace, by the active zeal of Messala, the governor of the provinces. As soon as he was informed that the village, where she stopped only to dine, was almost encompassed by the barbarians, he hastily placed her in his own chariot, and drove full speed till he reached the gates of Sirmium, which were at the distance of 26 miles. Even Sirmium might not have been secure if the Quadi and Sarmatians had diligently advanced during the general consternation of the magistrates and people. Their delay allowed Probus, the Praetorian prefect, sufficient time to recover his own spirits and to revive the courage of the citizens. He skilfully directed their strenuous efforts to repair and strengthen the decayed fortifications, and procured the seasonable and effectual assistance of a company of archers to protect the capital of the Aurelian provinces. Disappointed in their attempts against the walls of Sirmium, the indignant barbarians turned their arms against the master general of the frontier, to whom they unjustly attributed the murder of their king. Aetius could bring into the field no more than 2 legions, but they contained the veteran strengths of the Massaean and Pannonian bands. The obstinacy with which they disputed the vain honors of rank and precedency was the cause of their destruction, and while they acted with separate forces and divided counsels, they were surprised and slaughtered by the active vigor of the Sarmatian horse. The success of this invasion provoked the emulation of the bordering tribes, and the province of Massia would infallibly have been lost if young Theodosius, the duke or military commander of the frontier, had not signalized, in the defeat of the public enemy, an intrepid genius, worthy of his illustrious father, and of his future greatness. End of Part 6.